surgery remains an inherently male-dominated profession. In a recent survey, 22% of female surgeons were reported to perceive a glass ceiling in their training. We want to change the way people think about women in surgery and show students that surgery is an exciting and accessible career regardless of how you identify. We are Bristol WinS, and this is 22 Questions with.
Associate Professor Dr. Rhea Liang is a general and breast surgeon based in Queensland, surgical lead at Bond University, and women in surgery advocate and researcher. As well as being a specialist surgeon with Gold Coast Health, Dr. Liang holds a Master's in Surgical Education and develops and facilitates education programs for surgeons across Australia and New Zealand on behalf of the Royal Australian College of Surgeons. Recently, Dr. Liang has become a part of history by having her research study published in The Lancet's first ever edition devoted to women. The study, titled "Why Do Women Leave Surgical Training? A Qualitative and Feminist Study," Dr. Liang's ongoing research and advocacy for women in surgery has earned her an education scholarship with the Distinguished American College of Surgeons, making Dr. Liang the first Australasian recipient of the prestigious ACS award. So, Dr. Liang, we'd like to welcome you to this interview, and we'd like to start off by asking you, what is the first thing you did this morning?
Well, apart from the usual things like brush your teeth and get dressed, the first thing I did was drop the kids at school and then go and visit my GP to get my shots, which are overdue. So I was due for my, pertussis and tetanus shots. So now I have a sore left arm.
What is something you've recently learned about yourself?
Something I've recently learned about myself is that I have far more resilience than I realised. I think this year has been really challenging for a lot of us, and we've all had to dig quite deep. We have to be very compassionate to our colleagues who have struggled, but I have found, in fact, that having purpose in helping others around you and coming together has brought out reserves of energy in me that I didn't really even know I had. And so it's become really a global effort. Even things like being on social media at 1 a.m. can give you energy. You think you're tired, but you find other people who just need a listening ear, and we're all suffering the same sorts of problems all around the world. So that's a silver lining, I guess, in what has been a really awful year for a lot of us.
Perhaps moving back in time, what were you like as a student in medical school?
Oh, I was ghastly. I was quite young starting medical school. I was still only 17. I had been to an all-girls school, and so I was socially a little bit undercooked. As well as that, in my childhood, I'd been at times so pathologically shy that I think my parents thought I might be like that there was something pathologically shy. As it turned out, it was just that I hadn't quite found my tribe yet. My preference is still very introverted. I still prefer a quiet place and a book if I have the choice, but I have gradually learnt as I've matured as a consultant to get out there and communicate, because otherwise the ideas that you think of don't get shared around. But really as a student I was quite awkward, very shy, and not much of a networker.
If you could go back in time, what would you tell that shy, awkward medical student self?
I actually think that whole journey was part of the maturation process, and that if I'd arrived at medical school as a social butterfly, I might not have lurked around the corners as much as I did. Funnily enough, lurking around the corners was exactly what you needed to do to not join the mainstream and be a little bit different, and that's helped me in my path to think outside the square. So in actual fact, I would tell my awkward, shy self to just give it time, to just trust yourself and be yourself, and that you don't always have to do it like everyone else.
And moving more outwardly, what's the best piece of advice you've ever been personally given?
For that, I have to credit Annette Holian, who is one of the highest ranked females in the military service and a orthopaedic trauma surgeon in Australia. I was going through a rough patch, and she said, she belongs to the Navy, and she said, a ship under fire will only sink if it takes on water, meaning that you can face disrespectful behaviours and all sorts of abuse, but you won't sink unless you actually internalise that and take it, internalise it and really suffer with it. So what she was saying was, just bolt on your armour and sail on through. You can trust yourself to get through as long as you don't take on their water. And that little mantra has kept me going through quite a few tough times.
Who is the woman that you admire the most?
I mean, this year we've lost so many excellent women. I think top of my list would be Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So inspiring and tiny, just like me, like physically tiny, but humongous intellect and a huge influence on her profession. And a lot of it, when she talks about her early life, a lot of it is very mundane. She was a mum, she studied at law school, she'd struggled with the childcare. Really, her contribution relied on just plugging away and plugging away and plugging away at it for decades and decades and decades. So I think I'm inspired most that her lack of physical size didn't hold her back in any way, and that if you just keep jogging along with it, you will make an impact. And I think I see a little bit in myself, because although it seems like I talk a lot about diversity and feminism, one of the reasons my ideas are quite mature and well developed is that for about a decade and a half, it felt like no one was listening. It just went nowhere. It was just stuff we talked about in corners. But now, of course, it's being taken up into the mainstream, and that's really lovely to see. Sheer determination, I think, and the willingness to stick it out for about half a century.
So I guess the next question relates quite a lot back to your own research, but some say that medical education and the hospital environment is disproportionately rewarding to stereotypically masculine traits above feminine ones. Do you think this is the case?
It is the case at the moment, but we hope to change that. And a lot of that is raising awareness about why those things happen. It's not malicious for the large part. People are not malicious. It's just that they hold unconscious biases, which by their very nature are unconscious. So often I sit in meetings, and when they say, oh, so-and-so's, resigned his position, who shall we get to fill the place? They're still looking around their mates. And so you'll get people who are simultaneously, chair of this, chair of that, head of their department, and the lead of such and such research project. If we're going to counter those unconscious biases, which are not malicious, but we have to get more deliberate in the way that we bring people up, pipeline, as they say, to make sure that we're not filtering out the diversity that we need, and that we're not just getting mates. To some degree, we do it ourselves. So it is very trendy, of course, to go on about pale, male, stale, and we do, they are overrepresented in leadership positions at the moment. However, what we do know is things like women in surgery groups are often missing any males, and panel that is completely made of women is almost as bad as a panel that's completely made of men. We all have to make an effort to break out of our own silos if we're going to succeed. But for those people who are in power, who do belong to a particularly dominant demographic, and they have been rewarded not just for their ability, but also their age, their seniority, the colour of their skin, and their gender, if they can, must be much more deliberate about levelling the playing field.
Earlier, you alluded to a changing culture in surgical culture. What does this mean to you as a term?
Culture is this amorphous thing. A culture is most easily described as how we do things around here. So it doesn't matter what the policy is. We've all worked in organisations where the official policy was zero tolerance for racism, sexism, bullying, harassment. But we know that on the ground, what actually happens can be quite different. What happens on the ground is the actual culture, regardless of what you think the official culture is. Culture change is changing that. So it's not just about writing new policies or having new diversity initiatives or whatever you'd like to do in that regard, the official things. You will only know that you've achieved culture change when you see it change in the day-to-day, when there is an absence of sexism and an absence of discrimination.
Going back to your introduction, we of course established that your specialty and subspecialty respectively is in general and breast surgery. Why did you choose those particular specialties?
It actually starts earlier than that. Why did I choose surgery in the beginning? And I didn't really choose it, it chose me. I take my hat off to all those people who decide they want to do surgery at a young age, sometimes even before medical school, because they plug away and they work really hard towards it. But for me, I actually graduated wanting to be a GP. And it wasn't until I landed in a tiny hospital in a place called Rotorua in New Zealand that learning to operate became a matter of necessity, because there were only 4 general surgeons there and no accredited training positions. And if the junior doctors didn't learn to operate, then the bosses basically almost didn't get a cup of tea during the day. So they were quite motivated to at least teach you how to do the minor procedures so that you could tag team it. At that time, the bosses were saying, you've got awfully good hands, you pick things up quickly, you should think about training. And like any good woman, I thought, no, God, the training's too long, I want to have children, everyone tells me it can't be done, blah, blah, blah. And so just to totally ruin my chances, I went backpacking for a whole year with my husband, which is totally not what you do when you're committed to surgery. When I came back, I thought, right, now I'll knuckle down and apply for general practice. But I had the bosses from my old surgical rotations going, well, come on, you're PGY year 4 this year, why don't you apply? And I thought, what? you'll have me back. All my mates have been busy beavering away on PhDs, but it all worked out. And so I did get onto advanced training. It was just a matter of walking through doors that had been opened for me, not necessarily ones that I'd opened for myself. So I was very lucky in that regard. Breast surgery came a little bit later. I love the psychosocial aspects. I know a lot of surgical registrars dislike that aspect. You know, they are operating surgeons. They love the technical aspects. But I love talking to women and finding out about their lives. And I think that probably was one of the reasons I had originally chosen general practice, you know, that fascination and that with people's lives and so I don't think the GP in me has quite died yet. I think I still carry it with me into my surgical practice. And breast surgery was just very natural. I'd had myself some breast issues when I was younger, growing little hormonal lumps and just being terrified, because the moment you find one of those things when you're a medical student, you always think that you're about to die of breast cancer, you know, classical medical student's disease. So I'd been through it and understood some of the anxiety that people go through. I like the artistry of it. Some surgical specialties are very anatomy driven. If you do upper GI surgery, for example, it's very, you know, find this plane and then find this blood vessel and follow that blood vessel to, whereas the breast, it does have some landmarks, but largely it's art. It's like sculpting. To remove 20 or 30% of the volume and form it back into something that's functional for the woman and looks beautiful and fits their clothing while getting the margin on the cancer. And it's like clay sculpting, except that you have to worry about blood supply. There are times when you step back from the table and you're just so happy because it looks almost exactly like the breast you started with, except now it's got a scar across it, but you can't see the dent at all. So that really intrigued me. As we were coming to the latter parts of our training, the allocations would come out and some of my male colleagues would say, oh, I've got breast again. I don't think I can bear it. You know, breast clinics, crying women. And I'd be stuck there with my colorectal rotation going, oh, you know, and then of course we'd do a mutual swap and I'd end up doing a breast term and they could happily do my colorectal term and it was, you know, it was mutually beneficial. So I ended up, I think, putting together 4 consecutive breast terms towards the end of my training just before I became a consultant.
What are the challenges associated with your subspecialty?
It's the true holistic specialty. I mean, all specialties are holistic, but breast, I think, because the breast means so much to women, it's part of their social identity, it's part of their sexual identity. It actually has function. If we give someone a unilateral mastectomy, they actually start to have joint pains because of the way their chest wall mechanics have moved. Their shoulder might get stiff, they get a little bit asymmetrical, they often have to go to physio to work on the strength on one arm compared to the other to even themselves up. When you've grown up with essentially 2 lumps of ballast on your front, not to have them is really quite a thing. And practical things too, like if you are lower socioeconomic and someone changes the size of your breasts and you have to buy an entirely new wardrobe and new bras, you know, those things are expensive. So you have to factor all of this in. And then there's the whole sort of, they nourish our babies. It's life and death and reproduction and social and sexual, and, you know, they're just incredibly loaded organs as far as the meaning of them for us. And I don't know that there's another organ in the body that has quite the same significance. Even the males don't have an equivalent. People would say, well, it's like their testicles. And you're like, but your testicles aren't there on public show when you walk around the supermarket. No one can tell if you've only got one testicle, but certain people will certainly notice if you only have one boob. That's the challenge, I think, when you get a new breast cancer patient, is to bring all of those little jigsaw puzzle pieces together. And you can't always get the best outcome for every single aspect, but it's the discussion with the woman about what they prioritise and trying to get the very best outcome for them without losing sight of what you're there to do, which is to get rid of the cancer.
So I know a lot of what we discussed of you moving into your subspecialty was described as being luck. But do you have any advice for getting into your subspecialty?
Yes. So if I had my time over, I'd probably have started planning a bit earlier. Getting into surgery when I got in, and I'm talking sort of late 1990s, early 2000s, is quite a different deal from how it is now 2 decades later. There has been a marked increase in the number of medical graduates, and I gather that's the same in the UK as it is in Australia. There are limited training places compared to what it was. The training programs are much more structured and the requirements are higher for getting in. And so I don't know, it's funny, a group of us, all consultants, were talking recently, and we none of us thought that we would qualify on today's criteria if we had our time again. So I think you have to start planning a little bit earlier, especially the research requirements, recognizing that a good quality research project will take you easily 2, 3, 4 years. So that's something that you have to look at quite early. But the other thing is the power to connect with people is much greater than it was 20 years ago. We didn't have the internet. The only way you could meet people was to hang around looking hopeful at conferences, trying to get a word in with someone who might be influential, whereas now you can converse with them on social media and even at medical student level become known for the quality of your thinking and your engagement. That has downfalls as well, of course. Some people have been unwise in their social media interactions, and I'm sure they teach you about that lots at medical school, how to safeguard your future professional identity and not post things that might be detrimental to you later on. I think that social connection is important, not just to get on, but also in your future professional life. The selection criteria, of course, are very, you get 3 points for this and 1 point for that, and you gradually, make up your points for selection. Well, that's how it works in Australia anyway. It's all very objective, but quite beyond that, someone has to give you a job as a consultant when you qualify, and that often depends on who you know and who thinks well of you. The only other advice is I'd be like, this sounds a bit weird, but I frequently say to people, don't be afraid to quit. It is not some failure if you leave your surgical training, because that is far better, recognizing it at that point and finding something else to do that fulfills your ambitions, than to become a burnt out, cynical consultant. So there are too many surgeons, I think, who have pushed on through those last years of training and have found themselves stuck. They feel too old to retrain in anything else, but they bring their negativity to work every day and it infects their whole teams. And you may even at medical student level have worked on those teams where it just feels like the boss doesn't want to be there. They're not enthused about their work, and that cynicism kind of infects the whole team and affects the whole culture of the team, and it doesn't make it a joy to work there anymore. So don't be that person. If it becomes clear in your senior training that surgery is not for you, it is totally not a failure to quit.
What is something that most people don't know about being a surgeon?
A lot of people who haven't been in the operating theatres won't realise how mundane a lot of our work is. When you see it on television, it always seems like a very high-stressed, high-paced environment where you have to be on top of your game all the time. What they don't see is that in the downtimes, we put on music and we dance, or we talk about where the good sales are, what we're planning to do that weekend. Just ordinary chit-chat like anyone else, because it's a bit trite, but it is just a job. And you get very used to talking about these things, even as you might be kind of taking a scalpel to someone. Of course, the corollary of that is that you can switch on at any moment. You literally are on the knife's edge. At any moment, things can get very stressful very quickly. So it's that ability, I think, to switch from total chit-chat to really high concentration, high performance teamwork. And we train for that. We train for it. If you do your EMST or CRISP course, you will train for exactly what to do in those crisis situations. So you don't need to worry about that. If lay people could be a little fly on the wall, they'd be amazed how much of our day is just ordinary. If it weren't for the fact that we were operating, we'd be like people in any other workplace.
Do you remember the first operation where you were surgeon?
I do. It was actually while I was still a medical student. I'd admitted an appendicitis at 3 p.m, and I had bugged the surgical registrar, a lovely man called Mike Hugh Moyer, who's now a colorectal surgeon. I'd bugged him all afternoon to let me at least do some of the case. And we didn't get into theatre until quite late at night, 11 o'clock, because of some other acute cases. And I think the poor man was just so dog-tired, because these were the days before fatigue limits, the sort of hours limits that we have now. So dog-tired that I think he'd just given up in the face of nagging. He marked out the incision. This was also in the days of open appendicectomies. I'm showing my age here. But he marked out the incision in the patient's right iliac fossa and said, take the knife and make a cut and I'll take over in a moment. Well, he never actually got to take over in a moment, because I just kept going, and what do I do now? And what now? And what now? Not long after that, I was rather triumphantly holding an appendix. And he was very patient and took me all through it, and then showed me how to close in layers, as you used to with the open appendixes. And you know what it's like. It started at 11 and we were done not long after that. Back then, the open appendixes actually didn't take very long. But it was after midnight when we finished, and I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. I was just so full of adrenaline. I suppose maybe I should, in retrospect, have realised at that point that maybe surgery was a good thing for me. It was just an isolated event. It was probably another 2 years after that before I got to do another operation as a primary surgeon.
Would you say that you're ambitious?
I would, and I say that without any embarrassment or shame. I know it's a word that has got connotations, and it's particularly for women, the gender double standard. So it's all right for a man to be confident and brash and ambitious, but, not very ladylike for women. But I think I've started to own that word and to say, well, of course we have ambitions, we have goals, and I am ambitious and I do want to achieve those goals. And of course, my ultimate goal actually is to change the whole culture of surgery. I don't think you could get much more ambitious than that. Actually, my goal might have broadened from there, because as the idea has gotten traction in other fields outside of surgery, I'm like, maybe I can change the culture across the whole of medicine. Massive thought. And so it is that the Operate with Respect project that I chair with the College of Surgeons has now been taken up by 4 other professional colleges. RANS Co, which is the ophthalmologist, RANS COG, which is the obstetricians gynecologist, KICM, which is the critical care college, and ASIM, which is the emergency medicine college. And we're in discussion with 1 or 2 other colleges too at the moment. This sort of little idea that had been brewing in my head for a long time seems to be bearing fruit. And so I'm quite happy to say, yes, I am ambitious. I do hope I achieve that. We'll see how we go. Like I was saying for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, no, I'll keep plugging away at it for another half century or so.
Aside from your ambitions to change the whole culture of our medical careers as we know it, what personally was your best career move?
Best career move was to throw caution to the wind and follow my husband across the Tasman Sea. So I did all my training in New Zealand, and we had been consultants for 3 months when he landed a job on the Gold Coast of Australia, somewhere we had never worked or even visited. And I thought, I'm not doing that. These consultant jobs are very hard won and very hard to come by in the public sector. So it's like landing an NHS consultancy position. But in the end, I just threw caution to the wind and landed on the Gold Coast, having never visited here before, no family, no friends, and started afresh. I think you have to be a little bit brave like that. I think if I had stayed in my original unit, of course, I'd be quite a senior consultant by now. I am, thanks to my Asian genes, somewhat older than I look. I would have been a senior consultant, but it would have been in a very established unit. On the Gold Coast, which was a new and growing, back then it was just sort of the southern suburbs of the big city called Brisbane. Now it's a town in its own right. But I got to help establish a new breast unit, and a lot of these ideas about culture change, it was a testing or proving ground, because you were setting up the unit and you'd also say, well, let's start as we intend to carry on. We'll try a few things. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. Rather interestingly, asking everyone to, for instance, call everyone by first names did not work. Yeah, the literature suggests that if you can call everyone by first names, that will flatten the hierarchy and institute a more respectful culture. But actually, a lot of the nursing staff in particular said, well, that just makes me feel really awkward, walking up to you and just going, hello, Rhea. They felt happier just coming up and saying, Dr. Liang, blah, 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 blah. So after about 6 months of trying to do first name culture, we actually just said, look, you can call us by first names if you're comfortable doing that, and certainly the registrars do. Some of them still prefer to call me by titles, but basically use whatever title is comfortable for you, because it's not about what I think, it's about what my team members feel. My team members should be comfortable, and if they are more comfortable using titles, then we shouldn't force them to use first names.
When have you failed, and what has failure taught you?
Well, apart from that failure of the first name project, but lots of failures. I mean, there's an idea floating around on social media that everyone should keep a failure board just to remind themselves of how far they've come. And so, the number of papers that have been rejected, the number of research projects that kind of got so far and then fizzled out, the number of jobs I've applied to that I haven't gotten, number of prizes I've put my name in for that I haven't received. I don't know what people's failure rate is, but mine must be about 5 to 1. I don't know if people at your level actually realise that. I think what you see from the outside is a slightly glossy version of people, gradually making progress in their careers and winning various accolades and being given responsibilities. I don't think you realise quite how much we all get knocked back. And so I think when you are junior, the first few times it happens, it can be very dispiriting, very discouraging. But I think what you learn from that, once you start talking amongst your peers and realise that it's perfectly normal, is to just kind of go, oh, well, didn't get that, carry on. try for something else.
So the author and surgeon Atul Gawande once wrote, "Surgeons believe in practice, not talent." Do you agree with that statement?
To some degree, there has to be a little bit of talent, but most of what happens after that is practice. So we have a saying that most surgeons are made, not born. But at the same time, you do have to have a little bit of talent. It depends what you're going into. So I will tell you straight up, I have absolutely no talent whatsoever for any kind of endoscopy. I can't work those things to save myself. You know, all the little cogs and wheels to make those things go around your gut. I could never quite do it. I was a very slow and tedious endoscopist. However, when you give me a breast with no landmass and ask me, you know, just how are you going to reform this to make it look like a breast, even though you're going to take some out, somehow in my head, it's entirely innate. Like even from the first time I tried to do it, you'd be like, oh yes, this bit will advance into there and this bit will rotate around and that'll work. Some people cannot do it. You know, they just don't have that 3D visualization in their head. They will, however, for instance, do robotic surgery, you know, which is an entirely new skill set that I've had to play with the trainers and thought, well, thankfully, it doesn't look like it's coming into breast surgery anytime soon because I don't seem to have any great talent for it. So I think talent does play a role, but most of the rest is practice. It's a little bit like learning a musical instrument. You know, thousands of little kiddies will start piano lessons, for example, and some will distinguish themselves with some talent quite early, but unless they plan to stick with it for at least 10 years and practice diligently every night, they're still going to be as useless as anyone else. I reckon, you know, talent about 10% and practice the rest of it.
Earlier you alluded to potentially going down the general practice route. If you were not a surgeon, what career path would you follow?
Oh, so many things. And I still have plans for when I retire because, of course, we particularly women these days, can trust ourselves to have quite a long life. The average life expectancy in Australia at the moment for women is about 84 years. Yeah, I think it's much the same in the UK. And so if you plan to retire at 65, it's like, well, what are you going to do for the next 20 years, presuming that you have reasonable health to that point? So I think we all have to plan for a second career. I would love to go back to high school. I mean, presuming that I'm financially secure at that point, to go back to high school and help little people to learn to read. Because I think that's such a key skill that if you don't master it at that age, it handicaps you for the rest of your life. And I did manage to teach my own two little ones. I mean, they're not little anymore. I've got teenagers now. But when they were little, I did actually manage to teach both of them to read by the time they were about 4.5 before they started school. I'd love to do that. I'd love to spend more time with my music. I'd love to garden more. I'd like to dabble in a bit of engineering. When I applied for university out of Form 7, I applied for medicine and engineering. And I got into medicine, went and did medicine, but engineering is my other great love. And so I think I'd love to dabble a bit in that as well. But lots of options. I'll worry about that later.
So I guess in the same thread of reading, I don't know if you know, but within the UK, there's been quite an uptick in the number of doctors publishing their first-hand experiences of working in the NHS. Would you ever consider writing a book about your own experiences in public healthcare?
I mean, I think you could almost just publish my journals. I'm a journaler and I've done that since I was 13 years old. I have to say some of the stuff I wrote when I was a teenager is pretty side-splittingly hilarious and some of it is just awful and cringeworthy. But I have always notated down, you know, interesting cases and things that stood out to me. And so there's a treasure trove of stories there if anyone ever wants to dig into it. But out of respect for the actual patients, I mean, most of them are notable because, I mean, they'd be completely identifiable if you publish them because they're just so unique, is my worry. So I don't know. Maybe much, much later. But not right now.
On the same subject as books, what's one book that made a lasting impression on you?
Oh, there have been so many books, actually. I don't know that I can name any one book. And a lot of the books that have made a great impression on me aren't in medicine at all. So they're to do with your philosophy on life. So I think I might not answer that question because it would be unfair. I'd be bound to think of about 10 other books I should have mentioned about half an hour from now. I do think it is important to read very widely outside of medicine because, for instance, that study that I published in The Lancet, you'll see a lot of influence from sociological concepts and feminist theory. That's not something I was ever exposed to in my medical education, nor in my surgical training. That's from my other readings. Although you have to be fairly single-minded to become a surgeon in terms of focusing on your training, in terms of becoming a better surgeon and a better person, you have to make sure that you still remain very well-rounded.
So I think the next question is a bit unfair given your current research area, but if you could change just one thing about surgery to improve the experience of future female surgeons, what would it be?
Oh, well, I'd get rid of discrimination, basically. You can't get rid of unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is hardwired into our brains. Even some simple things like the foods that you prefer are very much based on what you grew up with. Unconscious biases are also how we form our diagnostic algorithms. When you present a case to your boss and you wonder how they come so quickly to a differential diagnosis, it's because they have developed a set of unconscious biases towards certain patterns. It's pattern recognition. So we can't get rid of unconscious biases, but we can become aware of them. We can make them conscious biases and thereby deliberately learn to counter them in the way that we behave. People will say, I want to get rid of bias. And it's like, you can't get rid of bias. You can, however, get rid of discrimination. And if we could just get rid of that one thing, I think that would make the biggest difference to women in the future of surgery.
And the final question is, what are you still learning?
Oh, so much. We've had to upskill very rapidly in a whole bunch of sociological and behavioural concepts to institute the Operating with Respect project. Of course, the thing is we've traditionally in surgery trained very much on technical skills and medical knowledge, but to be a surgeon is much more than that. So the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons has got a 9 competency model, and I'm sure your surgical colleges have got similar models where medical knowledge and technical proficiency are only 2 out of those 9, 10. We've got 10 now. And the non-technical, as we call them, skills, which I don't like because it kind of defines things by what they're not, but shall we call them the other professional skills, things like leadership, communication, teamwork, scholarship, all of those things we're learning very rapidly about because they have traditionally been a little bit neglected. What we've come to realize as we've developed those is that actually they're very well developed in other fields. So business, for example, organizations have often done a lot of work on business leadership and teaming, which is a verb, how to team effectively and things like that. And we don't borrow enough of it. So there's a sort of arrogance in surgery that surgery is somehow special, that no one else does the work we do, and so it stands apart. That's not actually true. The actual technical work we do, obviously architects or car mechanics are not going to be doing surgery on humans, but we're still human beings. We still work in teams. We still have leadership qualities. We can still borrow a lot of these ideas from other fields, and we need to do more of that to prevent ourselves from reinventing the wheel. So those are things that I'm learning very rapidly in. But the good thing about that is because of the work I do within the college, you can flow that learning directly to the benefit of the fellowship. So for example, I've helped to refine and still deliver the course called Surgeons as Leaders, and helped to develop a number of educational courses. And of course, the Operating with Respect course in itself was co-developed with the Operating with Respect committee, and we're still refining that as we go, and we don't realize, but these things are actually world leading. It's the first time in the world that people have put together courses like this, and the lag is very short. I will develop these ideas that go into the course only a year or 2 before they get rolled out to the general fellowship. So it drives me on because my learning is actually the surgical fellowship's learning, which is, it drives you on. It makes you very productive. You really feel that you can give back in that way.
Well, Dr. Liang, you've been an absolute joy to interview, and we thank you so much for taking the time from halfway across the world to join us here today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.